having me and having us here tonight, thanks to the Historical Society. I thought that message might be of particular relevance to the Whitlamites among us in the audience. Like the majority of the NT's Aborigines, the Gurindji people resided on a pastoral property for much of the 20th century. On Wave Hill Station, they provided semi-indentured labour in exchange for meagre rations or pay awarded at approximately 10% of the rate received by their non-Indigenous or Guardia counterparts. In 1966, they and other Aborigines residing on the station ended this feudal relationship when they famously walked to the nearby welfare settlement under the leadership of Vincent Lingiari and several other Gurindji men, announcing that they would no longer work for their employer. This represents old Wave Hill Station, where the Bestie Wave Hill Station used to be, and this is the route that they walked along. It's now a heritage listed. That's where Wave Hill Welfare Settlement was, just next to the Victoria River. It's now called Gurindji, and as I'll be describing, they walked a few months later up to a spot at Wattie Creek called Dagaragu. During the years 1967 to 69, Gurindji leaders elucidated a vision regarding the future of their people and the community that they were then illegally building. Elements of this vision included recognition of their land rights, the establishment of an independent Gurindji community, and their intention to run a cattle operation that would supply many Gurindji families with meat and employment. Of key relevance here, the elders' plan was that their community would be largely independent of whites and its facilities would be managed by their children and grandchildren. For 5 years, the attitude of coalition governments to the squatters at Wattie Creek was largely unsupportive. By the time the ALP came to power in 1972, the Gurindji and their fight for land rights were nationally well known, and in 1975, Prime Minister Gough Whitlam transferred a pastoral lease. While the Gurindji's struggle for their land is well known, I will talk tonight about another aspect of their elders' vision, education. I'll cite just one statement to illustrate their motivation and desires regarding the schooling of their children. In 1977, Pinchanumiari said, "We should have seen the young fellas in work in the social club," which is the shop in Dagaragu. "Together they've got to be taught. They must learn somehow through old people. They've got to know something. What about give a chance for Aborigine to take over? They don't want to be under white Europeans. To give them poor buggers a chance, we've got to get our children in school. They've got to be taught by old people. We've got to teach them so they can work the place. We like to see that take over all the time. Our children got to take over." The duration and details of their entreaties convey that Lingiari and others did not want a school at Dagaragu in the same way that they wanted a laundry, a mechanical workshop or even a clinic, goals that they expressed in 1970 but had little to say about afterwards. Rather, Gurindji statements between 1971 and 1985 show that they identified the provision of Western education at Dagaragu to their youth, supplemented by tuition the elders would provide in traditional law, as essential to the achievement of their vision of an ongoing, largely autonomous Gurindji society. The elders also believed it necessary that this schooling would occur at Dagaragu, a site over which they had growing influence and to which many of their dreaming stories relate. Although the Gurindji leaders' vision of a school was modest and clearly, if minimally, articulated, its desired effects were highly ambitious. I'll now turn to the question of whether or how this putative educational panacea, requiring, as the Gurindji leaders accepted, government funding to be realised, can be reconciled with the then aims of government at Wave Hill. Prior to the election won by Gough Whitlam in 1972, the McMahon government had maintained a position on the Gurindji taken in 1968, when the Gorton government made clear its intention to develop the welfare settlement and effectively ignore the Aborigines' plans for Dagaragu. When Australians elected an ALP government that promised to deliver a radical new policy of self-determination regarding the nation's Aborigines, such governmental indifference became subject to negotiation. As the name implied, self-determination and the Fraser government's subsequent self-management were concerned with giving Aboriginal people the right and the means to participate in decision-making about their own lives. Whitlam summarised, quote, "The basic object of my government's policy is to restore to the Aboriginal people of Australia their lost power of self-determination in economic, social and political affairs. To meet this challenge, Whitlam's new government created a Department of Aboriginal Affairs, or DAA, which was to use the Northern Territory as the initial arena in which it would develop self-determination into a reality. DAA Secretary Barry Dexter saw the challenge as one in which, quote, policies and programs must now be designed to enable Aboriginals to decide their own goals and to achieve them. At the same time, Whitlam decided not to give responsibility for the education of Northern Territory Aborigines to the DAA, but to give it to the Department of Education, which I'll simply refer to as the Department. This decision was made in part because authorities were keen to move away from the previous model of governance employed in remote settlements. In this, a single authority, the Welfare Branch of the Northern Territory Administration, had overseen all aspects of a community's affairs, including schooling. So the important thing about that I want to show you is that Gurindji, or the Wakefield Welfare Settlement, was included under the Welfare Branch Education Division and taught by them. Now the DAA wished to transfer responsibility for their own governance to Aboriginal residents, at the same time as devolving, as they called it, functional responsibilities for health and education to the departments with the requisite expertise. So there's a shift to this model, and during this period, during the 1970s, Gurindji School shifted over into the Commonwealth's Department of Education. To facilitate this, the new NT division was given vastly increased funding to improve and expand Aboriginal schools. Although Gurindji people never used the phrase self-determination, the coincidence of the articulated aims of the elders and the government's stated desire to support the realisation of Aboriginal goals is significant. One would assume, or I would anyway, that this congruity would tend towards local Aboriginal-inspired outcomes, which in this instance would have meant the on-site government-supported schooling of Gurindji children in the 3 Rs and traditional knowledge of Dagaragu. Surprisingly, however, given the tone of the government's policy, such an outcome was of little interest to its Department of Education. In late 1974, when it was flush with funds, the department held a series of meetings about the future of schooling in the Wakefield area. It can be seen in retrospect that this was a critical juncture in the 15-year campaign waged by Gurindji leaders to influence the schooling of their youth. Despite Pincher Numiari and supporters of the Gurindji, such as Jean Loy, lobbying at these meetings for a primary school to be built at Dagaragu, the department merely approved a major expansion of the existing school at the settlement, which was now called Gurindji, to cater to the children of both communities. The decision effectively perpetuated the earlier policies of the McMahon and Gorton governments regarding Wayfield's development. That is, to build up Gurindji and ignore the Aborigines' plans for Dagaragu. From the date of this decision onwards, and for reasons that I'll explain, lobbying such as that of journalist Frank Hardy in 1975 for a school at Wattie Creek was far less likely to succeed. Instead, at the same time as Gurindji itself was gazetted as an open town and not an Aboriginal community, the new school opened in October 1976. As a compensatory gesture, the DAA delivered a demountable preschool to Dagaragu, which I just wanted to show you a photo of a caravan. Although it was the policy of both the Whitlam and Fraser governments to provide a bilingual curriculum in Aboriginal schools, applications for a bilingual program at Gurindji were unsuccessful. The department deemed that there had been too much deterioration of the Gurindji language for such a program to be beneficial. Instead, the degree to which Gurindji culture was included in the curriculum depended on whoever the school principal was at the time. As a result, rather than the 50-50 two-way pedagogy envisaged by Lingiari in the late 1970s, only 6% of class time was conducted in Gurindji language. The refusal of authorities to implement a bilingual program provided them with the same type of self-serving rationale as the Gurindji school itself. While the existing school was used to justify the department's refusal to build a second one at Dagaragu, infrequent teaching in the Gurindji language did little to slow its deterioration, as they called it, which in turn provided the department with further reason for maintaining its English curriculum. So according to the rhetoric, self-determination and self-management policies were heavily reliant on consultation with Aboriginal communities. As I've described, though, Gurindji wishes regarding their children's education were ignored. As the department's decisions were impervious to or even inimical of the self-managing Gurindji agent promoted by policy, I now want to review the bureaucratic context in which this occurred. When the department was developing its plans for Wave Hill during 1973-74, it was, like the DAA, in the midst of a deliberately imposed break from the past. According to a major review of the department conducted in 1978 by Mitsuru Shimpo, there had been a, quote, deliberate emphasis on discontinuity of major education policies, meaning that materials and curricula were disregarded. The thinking among the Whitlam government's senior public servants was that anachronistic paternalism characterised the old welfare branch's work. In the department's rush to distance itself from this, little time was given to considering the merits of the previous regime, which achieved school attendance rates that have been rarely equalled since. Disregarded by the Education Department was the so-called Watts-Gallagher report of 1964. This document had provided teachers in welfare settlement schools with a specialised pedagogy and curriculum during the 1960s. These teachers had been subject to the author's maxims that, quote, Aboriginal culture must be recognised and respected by all teachers and instructors. And, quote, the education of Aborigines is a special field of education. All who work in this field need special training, etc. The adoption of these recommendations by the welfare branch had distinguished the NT from WA and Queensland, in which no provision was made for the differing socio-cultural backgrounds of Aboriginal children. Although Gallagher was employed within the new branch of the department, in 1973 his and Watts's report was discarded. It was not replaced by anything to guide the department regarding how self-determination should be translated into school pedagogy or teacher training. And in the absence of a specialised approach to Aboriginal education, a socially democratic ethos of universal education, as it might have been called, prevailed. The concept of a universal right to a universal education has a strong ideological history within the labour movement, and was perhaps more congruent with the traditional values of the ALP than those of self-determination, which recognised Aboriginal Australians as a distinct group requiring specific remedial activity and able to make unique claims upon the state. As the policies of the Whitlam government were implemented in the mid-1970s, these ideological incongruities were recognised but unresolved within the public service. In 1974, the DAA and the Department of Education senior bureaucrats conceded that without special measures, the universalist approach in remote schools could override the wishes of local Aborigines, effectively contravening self-determination policy, at least when it came to the schooling of their children. Bureaucrats recognised that due to the transfer of education to its own department, a fragmentation of support, they called it, had resulted. To remedy this, a task force with members from both the departments suggested that committees of Aborigines, teachers and DAA advisors should be established in each community to solicit local views on schooling. Due to the proliferation of such recommendations and frequent ideological differences between DAA and education staff, however, few were established. The tension between universalist service provision and consultative approaches to heterogeneous Aboriginality was exacerbated at Gurindji by the proximity and politics of Dagaragu. In 1974, a turf war between Gurindji authorities and the activists supporting the Gurindji was at its peak. So I just wanted to show you this. Over there is the Gurindji shop manager climbing up the pole to remove the Aboriginal flag, which has been placed there by these fellows who are from Dagaragu. They include the live-in supporter advising the Gurindji at Wattie Creek, and some of the more radical Gurindji leaders. According to people who were identified with this group, the pole would have barbed wire wrapped around it. There's a serious battle going on there. An attitude that Dagaragu was an unproductive camp of fringe dwellers, undeserving of support from the service-providing centre at Wave Hill, was common in Gurindji. Attendant to this was the notion that the Gurindji would inevitably abandon the village they had founded. For instance, in response to more entreaties from Gurindji leaders in 1979, a senior departmental staffer said that while he personally would, quote, like a school at Dagaragu, this was not possible as he could not convince the planners in Darwin that the people will stay there. The attitude was often employed to justify bureaucratic procrastination. Once the Gurindji school was opened in 1976, the ambition of Gurindji elders would have been seen by the department, if they were considered at all, as peripheral to its concerns. Authorities argued that a well-attended Dagaragu school would have led to a 50% drop in enrolments at Gurindji and a reduction in the number of staffing positions there. These considerations support Shimpo's finding in his review. He said that, quote, if the government spends money on a school, it tends to push the people to use it to justify expenditure. In this paper, I've described the centrality of education and schooling to Gurindji aims and shown that the education and schooling desired by Gurindji leaders, or the lack thereof, comprised a little known but significant failure of quotidian realities to match their self-determination type aims. I've shown that despite the professed intentions of the Whitlam government at Wave Hill, a designated Aboriginal settlement and school with a curriculum designed for Aboriginal children under assimilationist policy was replaced in favour of an open town with a mainstream pedagogy under the policy of self-determination. I've also argued that the allocation of responsibility for schooling Aboriginal children to a department barely aligned to the goals of self-determination created the conditions which stymied the Gurindji's educational plans at Dagaragu. By the early 1980s, many observers had belatedly recognised that the importance of education too, and its relationship with self-determination and self-management, had been badly underestimated. By then, the DAA believed that poor literacy and technical skills were the major impediment to the Gurindji's self-sufficiency. This prognosis was so common that the new NTG, the new Northern Territory government, employed adult educators to work in Aboriginal communities, providing vocational training to adults. The broader effects on Aboriginal education of the ill-defined, fractious and often non-existent relationship between education and DAA staff in communities had also been recognised. In Shimpo's 1978 report, he noted that the provision of services by discrete departments had generated significant confusion, he called it, for Aboriginal people, and recommended that governance on Aboriginal communities should return to a one-agency policy, under which a single agency would assume responsibility for education. It was a recognition of the merits of the centralised hierarchical structure, but not the ideology of the old welfare branch. In Gurindji, Shimpo's recommendations would have meant fewer non-Indigenous bosses, in inverted commas, and in theory at least, a greater coherence among those working with the Aboriginal population. Instead, the delivery of Shimpo's report coincided with Northern Territory self-government, and a new Northern Territory Government Education Department took up the role. A move which effectively inculcated another layer of official opposition to the prospect of an Aboriginal school at Dagaragu. By the time the elders received Aboriginal freehold title in 1986, both their vision and their ability to fight for it was diminished. Whether the construction of a Gurindji school at Dagaragu would have enjoyed the outcomes they envisaged is a moot point. What is clear is that in its absence, both the cohort of young Gurindji managers sought by Dagaragu's elders and the independence of their community remained elusive. Thank you.
What that strange noise was there in the beginning of your talk, technology. Questions?
So has any progress been made?
In the short time that I had to speak, I couldn't really describe the effect that individual staff had. So there was a period of 4 years, I think, during this period that I was talking about, where there was a principal and a supporting head teacher who stayed and worked and tried deliberately to involve the elders of the community in the schooling. And I gather that was it didn't work out. It wasn't a raging success, but more importantly, the kids who were at school at that time benefited from that a lot. And I think that's probably still the case. I think it largely comes down to the staff and their attitudes. Gurindji was at a moment of fame about 10 years ago when they had, I think it was possibly the first Aboriginal kids to reach the HSC in their home community. It was really significant.
Yes, Patricia.
Is Andrew Forrest from Western Australia Mines, he's doing a lot for the Aboriginal. Is he having any effect in this part of Australia, or is it just Western? I think he's trying to have Aboriginals more education all over Australia and, be employed. Is it having any effect? His money, he's billionaire.
Not that I know of.
Oh.
But that doesn't mean that it's...
Right.
Yeah, I'm not sure if he's active or in what way he would be.
He's done a lot for employing Aboriginals and also he wants their education to be a lot more, and I just thought this part might be affected.
It's true. And I mean, he's written a report for the government, hasn't he, that could trickle down.
Charlie, what's the status of these communities now? Are they existence of a certain size of young people, or have the young people moved off to somewhere else?
I think the population-wise hasn't changed much. It remains fairly static. There's a couple of hundred people in both communities, maybe 250. Young people are going, as they were in this period, back to Darwin and Alice Springs for high school and supposed Aboriginal boarding residential colleges. In the recent years, the local government reform in 2008 dismantled or subsumed the Dagoroga Council, so it's now part of a super shire, which I think has been incredibly detrimental. Certainly reduced local opportunity to participate in decision making about community issues. Sorry, I haven't got much good news.
Yeah, I had a question. I wondered if any of the children have reached university any children from the community have reached tertiary education.
I think that there have been a couple who've done some study at university. I don't know if any of them have graduated or got through a degree.
Yes, I am aware of at least a couple of Gurindji people who've been to university. I worked for many years at what's now Charles Darwin University, and we had Gurindji students there. I can think of a couple of names, but neither of them finished their education at Gurindji or Dagoroga. They finished their education in Darwin.
Yeah.
But I was going to also ask about the situation you're describing, and it's of course not unusual in the Northern Territory to have the problems that you've been discussing. Is there anything particularly distinctive about what happened in your particular area that makes it stand out from these more general difficulties of education for Aboriginal communities in remote areas?
Yeah, I mean, my problem is that I focus so much on this place that I'm lacking in the kind of the context of other communities. But I think the unique thing about the Gurindji situation, which is quite definitive in a way, is that this the disjuncture between the history of Dagaragu and Kalkaringi. So, you know, I wanted to address what happened at Dagaragu, but to do that, it's effectively becomes a question of what's happening at Kalkaringi. So I think, I mean, another example of the sort of way that this plays out is that in the 1980s, Aboriginal outstations were having little schools built on them all over the place. But again, because of the sort of singular history of the Gurindji and their land rights struggle, etc., that wasn't an opportunity that they could get a school at Dagaragu in that time either, and the tenure was actually used as one of the reasons why that wasn't possible. So, you know, in some ways their idiosyncratic path has kind of worked against them.
Please join me in thanking our presenters. Thank you so much.